Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me at this lunchtime webinar to go over everything you need to know about EV charging. Before I get started, I'd love to just do a quick sound check. So if you can hear me, just indicate that you can through the questions box. Just type in a little message. Great. Okay, it looks like folks can hear me. I've learned after doing these webinars for a couple of months now that it's always important to do a sound check before you get started. So thank you for humoring me on that. So welcome again. My name is Mal Skonron. I am a program associate for Green Energy Consumers Alliance, and I will be presenting this information today about EV charging. So whether you've owned an EV for years or you're just starting to think about buying your first electric car, I'm glad that you could join me here today. Just a few logistics before we get started. Everyone is muted to avoid background noise, but I am really excited to hear and answer your questions. So we'll have regular breaks so that I can take a look at what folks are sending in. And you can send those questions to me via the questions box as well. So you just had some practice using that for that sound check. All right, let's get started. If you haven't heard of Green Energy Consumers Alliance before, we're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to harness our power as energy consumers to speed the transition to a low carbon future. We accomplish that mission by working on a combination of advocacy and consumer-oriented programs. So we have programs to advocate for better energy efficiency policies at the state and local level. We also help encourage people to get heat pumps in order to transition away from fossil fuel heating systems. We help entire communities transition to renewable energy at a cost that is competitive to the basic service that you might get with your local utility company. And the program that I mostly work on is called Drive Green, which is an electric car discount program and education program to help people make the switch from a gas-powered vehicle to a plug-in electric vehicle. So Drive Green really is at the core trying to get electric cars on the road in place of gas-powered cars. The motivation for that is that EVs charged in New England can cut emissions by 75% per mile traveled compared to a gasoline-powered car. So for a lot of people, the environmental reason to switch is very compelling, on top of all of the other benefits to an electric car that you can learn more about on our website. And since the electricity grid is getting cleaner every year, the environmental benefits will only continue to grow. But electric cars are a new technology, and so making the transition from gas to electric at this time can be a little intimidating at first because it's pretty different from fueling a gas-powered car. And so this webinar today is really meant to help clarify how easy charging can be and how it can integrate into your lifestyle so that you feel ready to make the switch when it's time to replace your car. And so this information is applicable to you whether you're looking for a new car right now or whether you're just starting to think about an electric car and are still a couple of years away from making that switch. So today we'll talk about how charging works and the way that the majority of EV drivers do their charging, which is at level 1 and level 2 speeds, typically at home. And then we'll talk about both public and private charging options and how to find those in your area, as well as how to navigate using the fastest charging option, which is called level 3 or DC fast charging for when you are traveling or on the go and need a faster refuel time. And then finally, we will finish up the webinar by talking a little bit about those questions that y'all have, because I'm sure they are going to be really exciting and engaging, and I'm excited to hear from all of you. And so I do invite questions throughout the webinar, especially on clarity for the points that I make. And if you do see a topic here that you're wondering about in particular, just hold on to that question until we get to that section, because it's possible I answer it in a later slide. So let's get started. I find it easiest to start just by getting common vocabulary established, because electricity is not always the most intuitive thing to talk about. So knowing a few key terms can really help us understand what is going on with charging. This is not a class in electrical engineering, so I don't want you to feel too intimidated, but you are going to see these terms thrown around, and so it's good to have a general sense of what they mean. So the first thing on our vocab list is voltage. Voltage is defined as an electric potential, and it's determined by the power source that you're plugging into. The important thing to note is that household outlets deliver 120 volts, but you can install higher voltage outlets too, usually to support appliances that need a lot of power. So high voltage typically means higher capacity for electrical flow. And current is the easiest to understand, and it is that electrical flow. So it is the speed of flowing electrons, and how much current is flowing out of a power socket depends on how much power is required for whatever device that you've plugged into it. And so devices like an EV charging cable or an EV charging station will automatically draw whatever current that they need in a safe way, so that you can deliver the power required to your vehicle. And there are typically circuit breakers involved there to make sure that that current is managed at a safe level. And then finally, power is the one that we really care about, because power is all about delivering energy in a given amount of time. So higher power means faster charging, which means it takes less time to put miles into your vehicle, so that you can drive it around and take it places. Power is pretty directly proportional to the amount of voltage or current that you have from your power source. And so increasing either one of those two things will increase your charging speed. And then finally, energy just describes the total available capacity in your electric car to be able to drive it. So energy is what translates to the number of miles that you can drive on a full charge. And you can see there on the right-hand side, there is a helpful way to conceptualize it, which is if you think as electricity as water flowing through a pipe, then the speed that the water is flowing at is current. The diameter or thickness of the pipe is the pipe size, and you can think of that as potential. And then the amount of water that's flowing any given time is the power that you get out of it. So increasing either the size of that pipe or how quickly the water is flowing increases your power. So how does this translate to an electric vehicle? Well, the two biggest questions that people have of these cars is how far that they go and how fast they can charge. So those are really the two key questions to think about when you're thinking about transitioning to an electric car. And so that first question, how far you can go, depends on the size of the battery, the efficiency of the vehicle, and the weather. So we find that vehicles that have larger batteries can go further on a single charge. That makes sense. But typically vehicles vary depending on how efficient they are also. So if you have a smaller vehicle, it is more efficient and it can travel further using less energy compared to a bigger SUV or pickup truck type vehicle, which is very popular among consumers right now. And there are electric models coming very soon to make that happen. And then the weather impacts that driving distance as well. So you see electric cars have better performance in the warm weather months compared to the winter weather months. The question of how fast you can charge actually depends on quite a couple of different characteristics. So the power source, you can only charge as quickly as how much power is being given from your outlet that you're plugging into, or the charging station that you're plugging into. So that'll affect how fast you can charge. The other factor that would impact how fast you can charge is something called the onboard charger, which is different from the charging cable that you might use and think of as a charger, right? If you say charger, you're usually thinking of the cable that connects the device that you're charging to the power source, but that onboard charger is actually located in the vehicle. And what that does is it processes the power as it's entering the vehicle and changes it from AC power, which is what the outlet provides, to DC power so that it can be stored in the battery and then used to drive the vehicle. So the capacity of that onboard charger is a spec that you want to look into when you're thinking about your max charging speed. It tends to be pretty similar across modern electric vehicles, as we'll see in a couple of slides, but there is that factor to be looking at. And then finally, the weather also impacts how fast you can charge as well. In colder weather, you won't be able to charge as fast, and in warmer weather, like the great weather we've been experiencing in New England recently, you'll be able to get more miles and charge more quickly. So what does all of this translate to in terms of actual practical charging performance? So level 1 charging, it means just using a regular household outlet to plug your vehicle in. It is exactly like charging a smartphone. And every electric vehicle that's on the market today will be sold with this cable that you can actually plug in wherever there is an outlet accessible to you. And that cable tends to be about 20 to 25 feet long. And you can see you can get about 4 miles of range per hour of charging, but that can vary between 2 and 6 depending on the exact conditions. And there are 2 ports that enable this kind of charging. So Tesla vehicles have their own proprietary port, which is built into every Tesla electric car. So it'll come with a charging cable that suits that port. But then every other electric vehicle model available uses that J1772 port. So there is a good level of standardization across all electric vehicles. And I know what you're probably thinking. Household outlets really don't deliver a lot of power, and 4 miles of range in an hour of charging is pretty slow, especially when you compare it to what we're used to with gasoline, which is, you can easily refuel 300 or 350 miles in 5 minutes. But don't let 4 miles of range per hour of charging shock you. That's because charging really takes advantage of all of the time that a vehicle spends parked in one place. So if you think about how long you might leave your car parked at home where you have access to electricity, that can be 10 hours overnight, which is, plenty of time to recharge if you only drive about 40 miles a day, which is the average for American drivers. And so people really underestimate how useful this is. For most commutes, this is plenty. And I happen to own an electric car myself, and I rely on level 1 charging at home. And I'm not alone. About 1/3 of all EV drivers use this option. And, the important thing to remember is you're not sitting there with the car doing nothing the whole time it's charging. It just takes 5 seconds to plug in, and then you can continue to go about your day. So that is the slowest level of charging. Level 2 charging is an option that makes owning an electric vehicle a little bit more practical for people, especially folks that typically drive more than 40 miles in a day. So level 2 charging is much faster, and it's because there is special charging equipment that you can buy to increase that voltage that is being delivered to the car, as well as increase the current that is flowing to the car. So say you drive 250 miles in a day, you can easily recharge the entire car overnight by plugging into a level 2 station. And these are available both to install in your home as well as to use publicly. So there you can see a level 2 charging station up close and personal. The one end of the cable is the thing that plugs into the outlet. You will need to have access to a 240 volt outlet in order to plug in a special level 2 charging station. But that's exactly the same type of outlet that you might use for a washer or a dryer. And an electrician can install that pretty easily in order to make a level 2 charging station possible for your home. And then you'll see there's that box there that's kind of the main component. It's basically just a fancy circuit breaker that makes sure that the device is safe to use and it manages the charging speed for your vehicle. And then on the right there is an example of what you might plug in to the car. And level 2 charging takes advantage of the same 2 charging ports that we had discussed earlier. So you have that special Tesla port, and then the J1772, which is the standard for every other car. On the previous slide, it stated that level 2 charging can increase charging speed to about 11 to 25 miles per hour. And that's a pretty big range. So the next question is obviously, which cars can charge the fastest at level 2 and what causes the difference there? So again, it goes back to the onboard charger that I had mentioned before. So cars typically with large batteries, all electric vehicles, need to be able to charge at a faster level 2 rate because electricity is the only fuel source, right? So if you're charging at level 2, you need to be able to refuel fairly quickly. Whereas a lot of the slower rates of charge, you see at the bottom there, 11 miles of range per hour of charging, come with the plug-in hybrid models. So those are cars that have both a small battery to drive on electricity and then a gas-powered engine to back up for long trips. And you can see that those vehicles tend to charge a little bit slower at level 2 speeds, just because the battery is smaller. It ends up being about the same rate of charging time. So to fully charge a Chevy Volt, for example, it might take a similar amount of time as to charge the all-electric Chevy Bolt, for example, and that's just because the difference in battery sizes. But you can see here there is quite a lot of agreement on the electric vehicles that are available. They tend to charge at around 22 to 24 miles per hour of charging. And then we do see some significantly faster speeds in the luxury class with those Tesla vehicles, which can be as much as 25 to 30 miles of range per hour of charging. And note, this is all information that you can get from each car's spec sheet online. But many automakers tend to prefer to advertise in terms of total time to charge, which I think is a little misleading and not necessarily the best way to be thinking about charging. Because again, most people are not depleting their battery all the way to zero before plugging in again. It's more of, you get home and you notice your battery's running a little low, so you plug in, or you plug in to replenish the miles that you drove in that day. So as an example here, even if a car can charge really quickly, it can't draw more than what the station can dole out. So if you plug a car with a 7.2 kilowatt onboard charger into a 6.6 kilowatt station, it'll charge at 6.6 kilowatts. You can only draw as much power as is available at the station. But if you take that same car and plug it into a 10 kilowatt level 2 station, then it'll charge at the car's maximum charging rate, which is 7.2 kilowatts. So this is information that can help you navigate the public charging space, and it can also help you have a good sense of what to expect when you are deciding to make the transition to an electric vehicle. And we will talk a little bit more about how to find those public chargers, as well as how to install a level 2 charging station at home in the next section. But let me just take a look at some of the questions that people have up until this point that I did see come in. Oh, here's a great question. Thanks for sending this in. One person asks, what's the average cost of having a 220 outlet installed? That is a great question. So on average, we see level 2 charging stations cost about $1,200 total for installation and the purchase of the level 2 charging station. So depending on the model of charging equipment that you buy, there are some higher end models and some cheaper models. That cost can vary a little bit. But for the most part, installing a 220 volt outlet should only cost about $200 to $300, depending on what other work you need to do in order to make that installation. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next section as well. Another great question has come in. Many folks don't have access to charging in apartments or condo units. How do we address range anxiety in traveling several hundred miles? How do we deal with charging hogs who park for hours while plugged into a public charger? Those are all really great questions. I'll do my best to answer them quickly before we move on to the next section. Definitely charging at an apartment or condo is a problem if you don't have access to a parking space or a garage where you have access to electricity, or if you're in a space where you're parking on the street and you're not parking in the same place consistently. And that tends to be for folks that live in larger cities, but also condo dwellers as well. And the solution to that is greater public investment in charging. Particularly in the Massachusetts area, lots of cities and towns are making it a priority to help install these stations in places where it will be convenient for folks to be able to use them. So that means grocery stores, that means gyms, that means other places where you might leave your car parked for a long period of time, like work. So it's a matter of just increasing that public infrastructure. And I'll get to a few of your other questions in a bit because I will cover them in some future sections. Here's a really fun question. Why do EVs not have solar panels on top to charge them? Yeah, that's a great question. So solar panels are very heavy, and you need a lot of them in order to be able to charge a car. So, and it's kind of abstract to think about, but cars weigh, thousands of pounds, and they go at really high speeds. And so we need a lot of energy to be able to support them, to make those trips. And there's just limited roof space on top of a car to make it really practical. And then when you add the additional weight of solar panels, it just doesn't make sense. But there are a lot of charging stations that are being paired with solar panels, so that the solar energy from the sun is collected throughout the day. And then when someone plugs in, they're using that solar energy to charge. So same idea, but different application. Yeah. So someone just wrote in and said that they had an EV charger installed in their driveway, and due to the distance from their house, the cost was closer to $4,000. And with some qualified rebates, the actual cost will be closer to $3,000. And that definitely happens depending on the level of work that needs to occur. So if there's trenching that needs to happen in order to run cables through to a place where you're going to charge, that's going to cost more. Some folks, their home is older in terms of its electrical capacity, so sometimes that needs to be upgraded. And other times folks just don't have the capacity in their electrical box, in their circuit breaker, to be able to support another thing plugged into it. So 1200 is about the average for folks, but there are certainly people that pay more than that, which is why we have developed at Green Energy Consumers this guide to installing charging at home. Thank you for sending in that point because it was a great segue to this next section. So if you are approaching the process of installing a charging station at home, it can be really intimidating to know where to start and what to expect in terms of costs. And so this guide that we have developed will help you walk through some of those questions so that before you make the commitment of installing a charging station, you can get a sense of what you can expect in terms of costs, in terms of, how to pick out a charging station unit, and, what questions to ask your electrician to make sure that you're getting the best deal possible, while also not spending too much on that installation. So if you are concerned about the level of work that would need to be done, this is a great resource that I can make available after the webinar, but it is on our Green Energy Consumers website as well. And I do want to recognize some folks did send in other questions, which I will get to in our next section, but I'd be happy to just move us along. And there will be a recording of this webinar available, and the slides will be shared. So don't feel like you have to, scribble down notes. All of this information will be available for you. Moving on to the electric vehicle supply equipment, or those level 2 stations. There are hundreds of available charging units to choose from. But the two main questions that you want to be thinking about if you are planning on installing a charger at home is how much power do you want the station to deliver? And then do you want to be able to have advanced features like managing charging from your smartphone or being able to monitor your electricity usage remotely? So depending on those two questions, there are plenty of available units to choose from. You do want to get one that is UL listed to make sure that it's safe for your home. But that charging guide that I mentioned earlier also has plenty of recommendations of popular models. So I know Clipper Creek, for example, makes a really hardy, affordable unit. And then if you're interested in the more high-end models, the Juicebox and ChargePoint models are very popular as well. So we can support you as you are picking out this equipment. Sometimes electricians can make recommendations also. But if you are particular and you kind of have a sense of what you want to go for, then that guide can help you. So the next question is that I often hear from folks is they're wondering how much it costs to charge at home and how much the charging will add to their electricity bill. So the good news is that whether you're charging at level 1 or level 2 speeds, your electricity, if you're a residential electricity user, is billed based off of how much you use and not how much power you draw. So you can get a pretty good sense of how much electricity you'll use by just knowing how many miles you drive in a day. But generally, EV drivers can expect to pay about half as much in fuel compared to gasoline drivers or gasoline-powered car drivers. So on the screen there is a U.S. average from just a couple of days ago, comparing the cost of gasoline with an electric e-gallon. So you can see it's about half as much. I do want to recognize that, with the COVID situation and the fact that people are driving less and demand has gone down for gasoline, that gas prices have really plummeted in the last couple of months. And the good thing to note about electricity is that it is a really stable commodity. So the price of electricity won't dramatically shift up or down and you can budget for your fuel usage with an electric car for years to come because of that price stability. So as a method of comparison, Massachusetts has relatively high electric rates, and so we do see an increase in the amount of money that folks are paying compared to the average electricity user in the U.S. But even with gasoline rates as low as they've been in years, we see savings with that electric car. And there will be a time in a couple of months where gasoline prices shoot back up again because demand is high and people are getting back up on the roads again. Especially, post-COVID, a lot more people are buying cars in order to get around. So there's likely to be an even greater demand for gasoline, which means that that price will continue to be unstable. And you can easily imagine that price for gasoline going up to $2.60, which is what it was in January back before COVID. But even greater than that because of variations in the global oil market that just can't be controlled or anticipated. So as you think about your long-term fuel costs, I urge you to frame an electric car as a relatively stable expense, whereas gasoline can be dramatically higher or lower depending on the time. And, it's extremely risky to base a car decision based off of the cost of a commodity that's always fluctuating. And so even in Massachusetts, where those electricity rates are higher, people are still saving with the transition to electricity. And that's on top of all of the additional maintenance and repair costs that you can expect with an electric car. And to clarify, I mean savings on maintenance and repair costs, since electric cars are more reliable and generally need less repairs. But again, those are only the costs that you would see if you're charging at home. So the average is about, I think, depends on how much you're driving, but for folks that drive 200 miles regularly, it's really affordable. But again, there are a lot of folks that don't have access to charging at home, either because they're renters and can't, make changes to their electric system or can't install charging units, or just folks that have a wide variety of public charging options available, and so they make that work for them. And so on the map here, you can see a distribution of all of the public level 2 charging stations that are in your area. And that map comes from PlugShare, which is a really great tool to take a look at the common places where you park your car or where you visit or where you go to see if there are charging stations near you. And the reason I recommend going through that exercise is because unlike gas stations, which have huge signage that you can see, from miles away sometimes on the highway or when you're driving somewhere, EV chargers are small and often hidden from view. So unless you know where to look for them, you might mistake it for, a parking meter or some other type of infrastructure that's kind of roadside or next to a parking space. And so, especially if you live in the Boston metro area, there are more charging stations around than you might think. And so, but PlugShare is a great tool to be able to find those. The main thing to think about is people generally are finding charging stations through their phones and not that huge signage. And so there are several different public charging networks that you can take advantage of in order to charge your vehicle either on the go or just kind of conveniently as you happen upon them at the grocery store or at the gym or wherever you might leave your car parked for an extended period of time. And so because there are so many different public charging networks, the cost that you pay for charging tends to vary depending on the network and the charging station. So some of them work as like a subscription fee. So for example, Electrify America, which has those super fast charging stations that I'll talk a little bit more about, they have a subscription fee so that you can pay less if you pay some sort of monthly fee. So that would be really great for you if you are charging often and you're traveling hundreds of miles in a day. But for the most part, a lot of the level 2 stations that you'll see out and about either charge by the minute, so depending on how long you spend plugged in, or by the amount of electricity that you consume. And a lot of them are totally free, which is great, so that you can go to a parking area, maybe pay for parking if it's a public lot, but then you get that free charging. And parking is something that you might be paying for anyway if you're going to a theater or wherever else you might pay for parking at a large stadium or recreation area, places where you would already expect to pay. So EV drivers are finding that they can often get a few miles at destinations that they're going to already. And I do want to say ChargePoint is the biggest network in the Northeast by far. So if you are thinking about getting an EV, and you might want to think about checking out your public charging options, ChargePoint definitely has the most available. And so PlugShare kind of aggregates all of these different charging networks together so that you can see all of them. But once you start to notice stations in your area, you can kind of see which of the networks work best for you and which provide charging in your area. In addition to these networks, there are also non-network stations, so they don't have any smartphone integration and they aren't necessarily visible to the larger system. And those tend to be simpler stations, and you might not necessarily be taking advantage of them all the time, but they are available. So as an example of how you might use these different tools in order to locate charging, let's imagine we're taking a trip to the Roger Williams Park Zoo in Providence. It might be a while until you'd be able to make this kind of a trip, but I think this is kind of a fun example to see how you would use these tools. So, if you're already going to the zoo, you might just check, are there any stations available in the area? So you look, and in fact, yes, the zoo has a couple of ChargePoint stations available. They say what kinds of plugs you can use, so you can make sure that your car is compatible with the plug that's there. It seems to be open 24/7, and it tells you exactly where the charging stations are, so you don't have to be driving around the parking lot in search of them. And then once you find out it's a ChargePoint station, you can kind of switch gears and move to the ChargePoint app, and you can see when it's open and whether you have to pay for it or not. And then also whether it's available, right? So you don't want to show up to a public charging station and see that someone else is plugged in. So these online tools will actually help you determine whether you can even plug in at all, and whether you can, go and make your move and plug in, or whether you have to wait for someone else to finish up before you can do that. And so if you do spend 3 hours at the zoo, let's say, that would be 60 miles of driving that you're not paying for, and it's in an area where you're leaving your car anyway. So this kind of guerrilla charging, as it's called, is plugging in when it's available and what's convenient, has been really effective for a lot of EV owners, myself included. And a lot of organizations and destinations are making an effort to advertise their charging capabilities, or make them easily visible as you're entering, so that you can see, oh yes, there's a place for me to plug in. And I've definitely had that experience at quite a few different areas as well. Specifically, I've gone to a few Trader Joe's destinations where that was possible. So the fast charging paradigm is pretty similar. You find these stations on your phone, and it tends to be while you're traveling on the go. But before I get to that section, I'd love to see and answer some of these questions that folks have, because I see lots coming in. One person asks, batteries have a limited number of cycles that they can be cycled, and batteries are the largest mass and cost for cars. So what's the impact of topping off the batteries on the overall life and value of the car? That's a great question, and it gets to how you should be charging your car exactly. What is the best way to maximize the life of your car? And the thing that you really want to stay away from is overusing those fast charging networks and draining your battery all the way down to 0% before plugging in, and then charging it all the way to 100%. And then repeating that over and over again. So you'll find that that kind of topping off charging and charging more regularly when it's convenient tends to be more effective in terms of preserving battery health. But data shows that over the course of several years of driving, there's very negligible battery capacity loss over several years of driving. So as the technology improves, as battery management systems improve, that more of that work is being done by the technology inside of the car and less by, an individual's charging habits. And so as a user, you really don't have to think about this too much, except for, if you're constantly draining to 0 and then charging back up again. That's the use case you really want to avoid as much as possible. One person asks if any of the mobile apps tell you what charging stations are available and in use. Yes, I have the most experience with ChargePoint, and so that's the most common type of station that you'll see around. But they will tell you if someone else is plugged in. So if you do have to drive to get to a station, you're not going to be surprised and see that it's actually taken up. So if you are a person that doesn't have charging at home and you need to rely on charging stations available, you can be seeing whether someone is plugged into the one near you already before you leave your home and take your car there. So that information is made available to you as you navigate through these processes. One person asks, how do we prepare for hurricanes with EVs? If the grid's out for days or weeks, how will we fuel up? That is a really great question. So the experience that I can talk about is, I lived in New Jersey when Hurricane Sandy hit, and I remember being 10 days without power, and just seeing lines of folks miles long stretching out as people were waiting for gasoline, and there was just a total shortage, right? Because people were using gasoline to fuel their cars, people were using gasoline to fuel their generators, and it's clear that the system that we have now doesn't really enable people to be resilient in those circumstances, right? I'd say the status quo is that we are not prepared to deal with disasters of that scale. The really exciting opportunity for electric vehicles is what's called a vehicle-to-grid configuration, which is an idea that you can use the energy stored in your car as backup power for your home or some other devices that need power. So the idea is that instead of having an electric car be a liability for you, right, as something that needs to be charged, instead you're using the energy in that vehicle to be able to support other things. And because electric vehicles are something that utilities are planning for and integrating into their existing resources, these questions are being asked. And I'm an optimist, and I think that with the integration of EVs, we'll actually see better outcomes with long-term power outages and not worse outcomes. It's a really interesting and exciting question, so thank you for asking that. I'll answer one question before I move on to the last section. Do we have any estimates of the life of the batteries? I tend to keep a car for about 15 years. Yes, absolutely. There are estimates that exist to be able to track battery health performance. And the data that we have is really the usage data from existing electric vehicles. So people are tracking, electric vehicles have only been around since about 2012 or so. So that's 8 years of data. So we don't have, quite as much as 15 years. But the data shows that electric vehicles are holding up very well over time, and they're getting better as the technology improves. Recently, Tesla made an announcement that they anticipate their next generation of batteries to be able to last for 1 million miles, which is quite a long time compared to a gas-powered car, which 300,000 miles would be an achievement for a gas-powered car. And General Motors followed up on that announcement as well and said that they are also very close to unlocking the key to that technology. And so as the technology improves, we're going to see behavior that is, far superior to the existing gas-powered technology. And for the EVs that are coming out right now, they will at least match the performance of a gas-powered car. And you can see that reflected in lower lifetime maintenance costs, as well as lower lifetime repair costs as well. So those two things are connected, and we find that EV owners, for the most part, don't really ever have to worry about their battery health through the life of the car. And I know there is very exciting work being done in this field where, folks are hoping to make battery health data more accessible to EV owners so that, perhaps if you're interested in a used car, you could have that information accessible to you as well. And so while there is, great technology out there, it's still just moving really, really quickly. So great questions, everyone. Thank you for sending those in. I just have a couple more slides to get through, and then I would be happy to spend the rest of the time answering questions. So DC fast charging is also known as level 3 charging, and it can make charging an electric car for a road trip much faster. So we see with our level 1 or level 2 charging speeds, we can get up to 11 kilowatts of power. But with DC charging, the norm is 50 kilowatts, and there are many stations that can go up to 300 kilowatts of power. So you can imagine it's, 20 to 30 times faster than what we see available in our homes and in low-cost public stations. There are a couple of different port types for DC fast charging. There's the J1772 combo, which you'll see that top circle bit is the same as the regular J1772 found in all electric cars. But then the DC fast charging port has 2 additional prongs at the bottom there, which enables that faster charging. And then we have the CHAdeMO port, which is mostly found in Nissan and Mitsubishi vehicles, which has typically or historically been used for fast charging. But there was an announcement recently that all vehicles will be moving to that one standardized J1772 combo port. So while you still can buy vehicles with this port available, they will be being phased out, and it's unlikely that there's going to be much more development of this type of infrastructure in the future as well. And then we also have the one standardized Tesla port, which is unique to their vehicles and can be used for all 3 levels of charging. So how much faster is fast charging? Well, it really depends, again, on the vehicle. And even though fast charging reaches much faster rates of charging than what you could get with level 1 or level 2, there is still a cap. And that cap is based off of the internal battery management system within the car's computer. So as technology improves and automakers are finding better ways to manage battery health over a long period of time, we're going to see fast charging rates improve also. So for example, the Chevy Bolt has a max charging rate of 50 kilowatts, which means you can get about 90 miles of range in 30 minutes of driving, which is how they advertise it. A car like the Hyundai Kona, for example, has a max of about 77 kilowatts, so it's a little bit faster. But then the Nissan Leaf Plus can go all the way to 100 kilowatts, which is translates to 120 miles in 30 minutes. So again, as technology improves, we're going to be seeing these rates change dramatically. But we found that a lot of EV drivers make do with this level of fast charging simply by planning their trips well and including, time that's a layover time for fast charging in them. So this type of charging really enables those long distance trips in which, waiting an hour for 25 miles is just not going to be effective. The one thing to remember with fast charging is that it does introduce a lot of excess heat into the battery, and it's just generally a more stressful operating condition for the battery. And so it's really not meant to be used on a daily basis. Fast charging is an emergency option or an option to support you on that occasional long road trip. But for the most part, you'll get better health out of your battery and just lower costs by sticking to those level 1 and level 2 charging speeds. And it is important to note that because DC fast charging depends on the battery capacity or the state of charge within a vehicle, you're not actually going to be, charging at a consistent rate the whole time. It's like when you're close to empty, you can charge the fastest. Typically, the sweet spot is between 20 and 60% charge is when you can pretty consistently charge at fast charging speeds. And then after 60% or 80% charge, those speeds drop down significantly. So I think the question of DC fast charging networks is important because, most people do often take a longer road trip or drive hundreds of miles in a day in order to be able to go on vacation or, go to the beach or do whatever they do throughout the year. And so this DC fast charging network is really important to build out. But it is more expensive to be installing these high power chargers compared to having widespread level 2 charging available for folks. And so the priority for the next couple of years is really to install DC fast chargers in places where people are going to be making long distance trips. So that's high traffic corridors and highways, mostly along, the Mass Pike, I-90, I-95, and other major corridors in the Northeast. And so it's fairly easy to travel from Massachusetts all the way down to New York City or Philadelphia or DC based off of the existing infrastructure because there has been that prioritization. And there's also a great opportunity to install these charging stations in places that will entertain people as they're waiting. So if you have to wait an hour as your vehicle's charging so that you can make the final leg of your trip, that's the perfect time to grab a cup of coffee or grab lunch. So I do see an opportunity for restaurants, big box stores, and other businesses to use DC fast charging as a way to draw people as they're waiting for their cars to charge. And we do have some great blog posts written by folks that have gotten electric cars through the Drive Green program and how they've been able to take advantage of the existing network in order to be able to travel long distances. In particular, there was one blog post drafted by someone who drove all the way to California and traveled through Arizona and Nevada and states in the Southwest solely by, relying on the DC fast charging network that exists there. And across the country as well. So long distance trips are possible, they can happen. They just require a little bit more planning, and there are tools to be able to help you on those journeys. So while fast charging isn't yet ready to replace the 5-minute fuel time of gasoline, a lot of EV drivers have found that charging is more convenient than driving a gas-powered car, in the sense that it's something that you don't have to, take a trip out of your way to do. It's something that you can charge at home or at work to replenish the miles that you've driven in a day. And it's often lower cost than the gasoline-powered option, and you're not making separate detours. And so once you kind of get into that mentality and shift that, you can really start to imagine the possibilities and how an electric vehicle can work for you at this time. And especially if you have multiple cars in your household, making one of them electric really is kind of a no-brainer at this time, in terms of your charging capacity and how much money you can save by making that switch. So I'd love to spend the last couple of minutes that we have answering questions. And I do see that a lot of people sent in longer questions, and I will make sure to answer them in a follow-up to this webinar, along with all of the slides and a recording of the webinar as well, so you can review this information. And so let's see what people have to ask here. Someone asks, for trips and fast charging network, do the cars plan your trip and charging for you with alerts and directions to the stations? So that is a feature that Tesla has been able to integrate fairly easily, and that is something that you can accomplish with the help of a smartphone app. So you use your smartphone to find the stations, and then you can use your smartphone to get to them along the route. So there are plenty of route planner options available that will automatically kind of set those stops for you in order to optimize the range of your vehicle and also the time that you spend charging. So it's not built into the car itself, but there are tools to be able to help you do that. And I will definitely pass along the blog post written by one of our members, which might provide some more clarity for you on that. And again, it is 1 o'clock, so if you do have to step away, I will send this recording out if you're interested in the rest of the questions. But if you want to stick around, I am happy to continue to answer questions for the next couple of minutes. So one person did ask about range anxiety and how to get over that if you're traveling several hundred miles. And I think addressing the issue of range anxiety is a combination of two things. It's one, that kind of mentality shift of, if you're thinking about how often you really travel hundreds of miles in a day, it's pretty infrequently, right? Like most people use their cars to get around town and to do local driving. And in that capacity, it's extremely easy to switch to an EV. And then when you are planning for those longer distance trips, you need to take a look at where you're going and kind of what the circumstances are for that trip. So again, longer road trips in an EV require a little bit more planning, but for the added benefit of those environmental costs, those fuel savings, maintenance savings, EV drivers are finding that the biggest barrier is really just that sense of uncertainty, right? It's new. You don't see a lot of people doing it, so it seems scarier than it is. But based off of the experience that people have had so far, it's really less of an issue once you actually make the jump to own an electric car, which is maybe not the most satisfying answer to that question. But as you speak to folks and get their experiences, that tends to be the resounding consensus. So someone else does mention range as well as a potential barrier. there is some discussion of the Cybertruck as, a long range vehicle, but, not really kind of practical for the average consumer, right? And so I think in terms of thinking about planning for these longer trips, and thinking about range, if you do make really long trips, and you do so consistently and you're just not ready to switch over to an electric car yet, there are plug-in hybrid options available that can considerably lower your carbon footprint and make all of your local miles electric while still having that big gas backup for those longer trips if you are concerned about it. So as an example, I can speak to my own experience. I own a plug-in hybrid, both because, going all electric, even for a used car, just wasn't in my budget. And I'm a hiker and I'm a camper, and I frequently drive to out-of-state places from Rhode Island in order to be able to do those things that I love. And so, even with that, I only do that maybe once or twice a month when the weather is good, and maybe once a month when the weather is bad. And so it's great to be able to have an electric engine to support my local driving, going to the grocery store, doing those daily tasks. And that makes up like 75% of my driving is all electric. And then for those longer trips, I do have that gas backup. So if you take an honest look at your situation and you realize, I drive long distance all the time, it's fairly unpredictable, that difficulty is kind of really present and real for me, then that plug-in hybrid option might be better for you. The other option that only applies if you already have another car in your household is that if you have two cars, you can set one as your around the town car, and that's your electric car where you take shorter trips, and that's where you do the majority of your driving. And then you still have your gas car to support you on those longer trips. So that's not an option for everyone because it assumes you're already owning two cars. But the reason to switch is most compelling in that situation, right? Is like you have a little bit more flexibility in terms of your vehicle option, and so you can make that decision. But a good exercise I would recommend is that just kind of plan a sample trip for yourself. I know when I drive to my parents' house in New Jersey, I always plug in at their home, and they're totally fine with it because, again, it's $1 or $2 for me to plug in my vehicle. And so that is something that is, if you're visiting folks and you have a place to plug in wherever you're visiting, that's a conversation you could have. You could even compensate folks depending on how much electricity you consume. And so there are workable options out there, and just having those conversations and asking folks like what they feel comfortable with. Could you plug in to wherever you're staying? I think is really reasonable, especially with that charging cable that you have in your car. One person has asked, what's the typical max range of an electric vehicle? So that can really vary depending on the car and when it was produced. We see, the Nissan Leaf from 2017 only has 150 all-electric miles, but then the newest Nissan Leafs have over 220 electric miles. And then, the Chevy Bolt, Hyundai Kona are all in the 260-mile range. So it can really vary depending on the vehicle. And so I recommend checking out the Drive Green car comparison shopping tool in order to compare those vehicles and see what level of range you would be comfortable with. Okay, there still are a lot of great questions, and I think I'm happy to reach out to folks to help answer some of those questions. But in the interest of time and also lunch, since it is past 1 p.m., I think this would be a good stopping point for this webinar. But I do encourage you to reach out to me if there are other questions that percolate. and you haven't necessarily asked yet, but if you think of them, definitely reach out. You can reach me at mal@greenenergyconsumers.org. I'm working remotely, so I don't have access to that number. So email is definitely the best place to reach me, and I will follow up with all of the resources that we talked about today. So thank you everyone for coming and for staying engaged in this hour. I'm really excited to be able to, start to enable this conversation for you folks, depending on if you're shopping now or if you're just starting to think about going electric. So thank you again for joining me this afternoon, and have a great rest of your day.